In the forgotten lands, where the wind howled ancient songs through the crevices of a ruined castle, lived old Ilara. His hands, once firm in forge and sword, now trembled with cold and age, but his spirit remained as resilient as the moss-covered stones he tried to mend. Driven from the village by a cruel lord, Ilara and his two orphaned grandsons, young Finn, strong as an oak, and little Liam, frail as a winter branch, found refuge in what the villagers called the Cursed Hill. It was a decaying castle, its towers crumbling, its stained glass windows shattered, a ghostly echo of long-lost grandeur. Moss covered the cold stones, and the roof dripped promises of a harsh winter. Hunger was a constant shadow, and the scorn of the few travelers who passed by was a chill as biting as the wind. But Ilara, with the wisdom of ancient legends in his heart and a promise to his deceased wife to protect his family, would not give up. He saw more than ruins. He saw a home, a secret waiting to be unearthed beneath the grey stones. The cold of that night was a silent predator, creeping through the cracks in the crumbling walls, biting at the flesh of those who sheltered there. Ilara, his back bent and his eyes heavy with worry, watched Finn and Liam. The elder Finn tried to light a fire with damp branches, frustration creasing his young face. Liam, the younger, was huddled under a tattered blanket, a dry cough tearing at his tiny chest. Every sound, every tremor of the small body was a stab to the old man's heart. Hunger, an old companion, tightened everyone's stomachs, but for Liam, it was an even crueler threat. "Don't worry, Grandpa," Finn said, his voice hoarse. "I'll find something tomorrow. I promise." Ilara merely nodded, a lump in his throat. Finn's promise was a fragile balm against the stark reality. They had scoured the ruins for days, finding only dust, stones, and echoes of a glorious past that mocked their present misery. The humiliation of being driven out, of being called the old man of clay for trying to fix his home with cheap mud, still burned. Now they lived in a ruin of mud and stone, and the irony was a slow poison. The next morning, the pale sun barely managed to pierce the mist clinging to the cursed hill. Liam was weaker. His skin, once rosy, now had a greyish tint, and his eyes, too large for his emaciated face, held a deep sadness. Ilara knew there was no more time to wait. He needed clean water, food, a shelter that could protect his grandsons from the approaching winter. "Stay here," Ilara instructed, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "I will look for a spring, or something we can use to fix the roof." Armed with a rusty shovel and a determination that defied his age, Ilara ventured deeper into the castle's bowels. He descended spiral stairs that seemed to lead to the heart of the earth, the air growing damper and heavier with each step. The smell of mold and wet earth filled his nostrils. He hoped to find an ancient well, perhaps an underground reservoir. Instead, what he found was a forgotten chamber, hidden beneath a moss-covered stone slab that gave way under his weight. The chamber was dark and cold, but in the center, a pool of stagnant water reflected a strange, almost inviting glow. And around the pool, the earth was not like common earth. It was a dark-colored clay, almost black, with a damp sheen and a strangely malleable texture. It was not common clay. It seemed to pulse with a silent energy, unlike anything Ilara had ever touched. Curiosity, stronger than fear, impelled him to kneel. He picked up a handful of that clay. It was cold, but not freezing, and its consistency was perfect, neither too liquid nor too solid. In his hands, it seemed to have a life of its own, molding with surprising ease. Remembering Liam's thirst, Ilara, almost by instinct, began to shape a small cup. His hands, once skilled in the forge, found a forgotten rhythm in the clay. He worked the clay, smoothing the edges, forming a base. When he finished, the cup was crude but functional, He placed it on the stone floor, expecting it to dry or perhaps to disintegrate like everything else. But the cup did not dry. Instead, a slight vibration ran through the piece. Ilara blinked, rubbing his eyes, thinking that hunger and exhaustion were playing tricks on his mind. But the vibration continued, subtle, almost imperceptible. Then the shape of the cup began to alter. The edges rounded, the base widened slightly, as if the clay were adjusting, perfecting itself. And then, to Ilara's horror and astonishment, small protrusions appeared on the side, like tiny handles, and the cup, previously inanimate, moved. It didn't roll, it didn't fall. It crawled an inch, then another towards the pool of water. Ilara's heart pounded. His eyes, which had witnessed so many battles and losses, now saw something that defied all logic. The cup, made of clay, was alive. He watched, paralyzed, as the small object tilted, dipped its rim into the water and, with an almost conscious movement, filled itself. Then, with the same deliberate slowness, it crawled back, stopping at Ilara's feet. The old man reached out a trembling hand and picked up the cup. The water was fresh, clean, but it wasn't the water that shocked him. It was the vessel. He had created something from clay, and that something had come to life and fulfilled a task. The humiliation of being called the old man of clay echoed in his mind. But now the word clay brought not shame, but unimaginable power. A new flame ignited in Ilara's eyes, a flame not of despair, but of a wild and dangerous hope. If a cup could come to life, what else could he create? A servant to carry water, a builder to repair the castle. An audacious, almost blasphemous idea began to form in his mind. He looked at the dark, pulsating clay, and then at the cup in his hand. Liam needed help. Finn needed a home. And Ilara, the humiliated old man, suddenly saw a way to not only survive, but to rewrite his own destiny. The clay that was once his ruin was now the promise of a kingdom. That clay cup, now in his hands, was not just a vessel for water. It was living proof of a miracle, a whisper of power echoing in the forgotten depths of the castle. Ilara held it, feeling the cold dampness, the weight of the water, but above all, the weight of a revelation. His eyes, previously tired and filled with despair, now burned with a renewed, almost feverish intensity. The humiliation, the hunger, the cold, all of it seemed to diminish before the magnitude of what he had discovered. Liam, the image of his frail grandson, coughing under the tattered blanket, cut through the fog of his astonishment. There was no time for contemplation. That cup was a beginning, but Liam needed more than fresh water. He needed warmth, food, a safe shelter. And Ilara, the humiliated old man, now had the tool to build all of it. He looked at the pool of dark, almost black clay, which pulsed with a silent life. It wasn't just earth, it was the promise of a new world, molded by his own hands. With the cup still in his hand, Ilara knelt again, his mind teeming with possibilities. If a cup could move, what else could? The idea of a servant sprouted in his mind, almost like a seed planted in fertile soil. Not a servant of flesh and blood, but one of clay, obedient, tireless. He reached out and took another handful of that magical substance. It was malleable, responding to every touch, every pressure of his aged fingers. With an urgency that made him forget the pain in his back, Ilara began to mold. Not a cup this time, but a figure. He started with a solid base, then a torso, rudimentary arms, a featureless head. He sought not beauty, but functionality. As his hands worked, he whispered his desires, his needs, imbuing the clay with his will. Bring water, more water, and then wood. We need warmth. He visualized the creature, imagined it fulfilling its tasks. When the figure was complete, crude but unmistakably humanoid, about a third of his own height, Ilara placed it on the ground. The same subtle vibration he had felt in the cup ran through the figure. Then the arms moved, slowly, as if awakening from a deep sleep. The head lifted, and the creature, made of clay, stood up. It had no eyes, but Ilara felt that it saw him, that it understood his intention. The clay servant, as Ilara named it in his mind, turned and, with slow, deliberate movements, walked towards the pool of water. There was no hesitation. It bent down and with its own clay hands began to gather the water, not into a cup, but directly into its own body, which seemed to absorb it, becoming wetter and more malleable. It was as if it were replenishing itself, strengthening itself. Ilara watched, his heart pounding in his chest. It was real. It wasn't a feverish dream. He had created life, and that life was at his service. The creature, now more robust, turned back to him, awaiting its next instruction. Ilara's mind raced. Wood. Yes, he needed wood for Finn's fire, to warm Liam. "Go!" Ilara commanded, pointing into the darkness beyond the chamber. "Find wood, dry branches, anything you can carry. Bring it up." The clay servant nodded with an imperceptible movement of its featureless head, and moved. Its steps were silent, the clay barely leaving marks on the damp stone floor. Ilara followed, the magical water cup still in his hand, new hope pulsing in his veins. As they ascended the spiral stairs, the clay servant moved with surprising efficiency, exploring every niche, every crack, in search of material. Ilara watched it collect pieces of rotten wood, fallen branches, even loose stones that could be used to reinforce the walls. There was no tiredness, no complaints, only silent, infallible obedience. The pale morning light barely reached the chamber entrance when Ilara and his first clay servant emerged. The servant carried an impressive pile of branches and debris, more than Ilara or Finn could have carried alone. The cold morning air seemed less biting now, warmed by the flame of discovery. Finn was sitting by the dying fire, his face still marked by frustration. Liam was paler than before, his breathing shallow. Ilara felt a pang in his chest, but the new certainty propelled him. "Finn!" Ilara called, his voice stronger than he expected. "I brought water and help." Finn turned, his eyes wide at the sight of the clay figure beside his grandfather. He stood abruptly, his hand instinctively reaching for a non-existent weapon. "Grandpa, what is that?" "It's a servant, my boy," Ilara said, his voice filled with a strange authority. "A clay servant. It will help us." He extended the cup of water to Finn. "Give this to Liam. It's pure water from the deepest spring." Finn, still in shock, took the cup. The water seemed to glow with an unusual purity. He approached Liam and carefully helped him drink. Each sip seemed to bring a little color back to the boy's face. The cough subsided, his breathing became smoother. While Finn cared for Liam, Ilara instructed his clay servant to deposit the wood near the fire. The servant obeyed without question, and soon the fire, fed with the dry branches, crackled with new life, casting a welcome warmth through the room. Finn's face, previously tense, relaxed slightly as he saw Liam improving and the fire kindling, but his eyes still fixed on the clay servant with a mixture of fascination and fear. "Grandpa, how did you do that?" Ilara smiled, a smile that had not appeared on his wrinkled face in a long time. "The earth here, Finn, it is magical. It responds to our will, and I have a very strong will to protect you." He looked at the clay servant, then at the vast expanse of ruins around them. "We will not just survive, Finn. We will rebuild, and we will no longer be humiliated. The clay they called our ruin will be the foundation of our kingdom." Ilara's vision extended beyond the decaying castle to the distant lands that once belonged to others. He saw not just a home, but an empire, born of clay and his own unwavering determination. The first servant was just the beginning. He needed more, many more. and each of them would be a brick in the construction of his revenge, his redemption, his new destiny. The old man of clay was dead. Long live the king of clay. Ilara's declaration echoed through the damp stones of the castle, a whispered prophecy that the wind seemed to carry beyond the crumbling walls. The old man of clay was dead. Long live the king of clay. It was not just a phrase, it was an oath, etched into the weary soul of a humiliated man who had found unimaginable power. He looked at the first servant who now, with the fire lit and Liam more comfortable, waited in silence, a statue of obedience. Ilara's mind seethed. One servant was good, but an army. That was the promise of a kingdom. With an energy that defied his age, he descended again to the underground chamber, the magical water cup still in his hand, a tangible reminder of the miracle. The pool of dark clay seemed to call him, pulsing with latent energy, waiting to be molded. This time, Ilara did not hesitate. He did not mold a cup, nor a single figure. With agile hands and a focused mind, he began to work at a feverish pace. He took generous handfuls of the clay, kneading it, twisting it, shaping new creatures. They were not works of art, but tools. Each one was a crude replica of the first, featureless without details, just the essential form of a worker. He lined them up on the stone floor, each one waiting for his breath of life. "Work," he whispered, imbuing each figure with his intention. "Build, clean, protect." The subtle vibration, now familiar, ran through each new creation. One by one, the clay figures rose, their movements slow and deliberate, but filled with a newfound purpose. Ilara watched them, his heart swelling with a mixture of triumph and reverence. The air in the chamber seemed to vibrate with the silent presence of his new subjects. There were 10, then 20. Soon the chamber was filled with a legion of clay servants, all awaiting their creator's orders. He led them out of the chamber, a silent and determined procession. Finn, who had fallen asleep beside Liam, awoke to the muffled sound of multiple footsteps. His eyes widened as he saw the horde of clay figures emerging from the darkness, each identical to the first. "Grandpa!" Finn exclaimed, recoiling. "What? What is that?" "It's our army, Finn," Ilara replied, his voice choked with emotion. "They will rebuild our home. They will protect us." He pointed to the ruins around them, to the crumbling walls, the debris blocking passages, the cracks that let the cold wind in. "Clean, repair, fortify, begin." The clay servants spread out, each moving with eerie efficiency. There was no confusion, no need for detailed instructions. They seemed to grasp the essence of the task. Clay arms began to lift heavy stones, sweep debris, fill cracks with more magical clay that seemed to solidify on contact. The castle, once a monument to decay, began to hum with silent activity. Finn watched, open-mouthed. The initial fear gave way to astonished fascination. He saw a servant lift a wooden beam that he and Ilara could never have moved. Another began to mend a section of the roof, using the clay itself to create a barrier against the wind. The transformation was almost instantaneous. The cold air that once cut through the room diminished. The sound of the howling wind was muffled. Liam, still weak, coughed, but this time the cough seemed softer. Ilara approached his grandson, his face marked by worry, but also by hope. "He needs more than shelter, Finn. He needs food and constant warmth." He turned to his servants. "Seek wood, lots of wood, and look for sources of food, roots, fruits, anything edible the earth can offer. Bring it here." A portion of the servants headed for the surrounding forests, their silent steps barely disturbing the morning's quiet. Another portion continued to work on the castle, hour by hour transforming more and more of the ruins into a habitable home. The walls were reinforced, the cracks sealed, and a new fireplace, built with the magical clay, radiated a constant comforting warmth. Finn, seeing Liam's improvement and the miraculous progress, began to lose his fear. He approached Ilara, his eyes still full of questions, but now also with a reluctant admiration. "Grandpa, they're incredible, they don't tire." "No, my boy," Ilara replied, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "They don't tire, and they don't question, they just serve." He looked at the castle, which now, under the tireless action of his servants, seemed to be reborn from the ashes. "But we cannot just stay here, Finn. This castle is only the beginning. We need more resources, more lands, and we need eyes to see what lies beyond our walls." Ilara's ambition grew with every brick of clay laid, every branch of wood brought. He was not just building a home, he was building an empire. The humiliation he had suffered, the laughter and scornful glances of those who called him the old man of clay, now fueled a flame of vengeance that burned in his chest. He would no longer be the humiliated, he would be the king, but the silent, supernatural activity of the castle would not go unnoticed forever. The clay servants, though efficient, were strange, unnatural. Their movements, their unquestioning obedience, the speed with which the ruins were being restored, all of it was a challenge to the natural order of the world. Soon, whispers would begin, rumors would spread, and curious eyes would turn towards the castle of the old man of clay. Ilara knew that his new kingdom would not be built without opposition. Tension was a thin mist in the air, a premonition that newly discovered power would bring with it not only redemption, but also conflict. Ilara's game was just beginning, and the pieces on his board were made of clay and unwavering will. The castle, once a skeleton of stone and shame, now pulsed with a strange, silent life. Where once the wind howled through cracks and holes, now walls of magical clay rose, solid and impenetrable. The ruins were being not just restored, but reinvented. The newly built fireplace, a monument of clay and stones, radiated constant warmth, banishing the biting cold that had for so long been Ilara's only companion. Liam, wrapped in furs and blankets, breathed more easily, his cough diminishing to an occasional whisper. The spring water, combined with the warmth and security, was working its own miracle. But Ilara was not a man of half measures. His vision extended far beyond his grandson's safety. He walked through the now clean corridors, watching his clay servants work with an eerie precision. They were not just builders. They were the manifestation of his will, the tool of his redemption, the humiliation he had endured, the laughter and scornful glances of those who called him the old man of clay, now fueled a flame of vengeance that burned in his chest, more intense than any bonfire. "We cannot just stay here, Finn," Ilara said, his voice resonating with a new authority as he watched a group of servants erect a new watchtower, molded from clay and stone. "This castle is only the beginning. We need more resources, more lands, and we need eyes to see what lies beyond our walls." Finn, who had moved from shock to fascination, now felt a shiver run down his spine. The grandfather he knew, the man who cowered under the weight of shame, had disappeared. In his place was an imposing figure whose eyes gleamed with an almost feverish ambition. He watched the servants, who were now not just dozens, but hundreds, transforming the ruins into a fortress. They did not tire, they did not speak, they did not feel. They were perfect, and that somehow was the most terrifying thing. "Grandpa, what do you mean by eyes?" Finn asked, his voice a little shaky. Ilara smiled, a smile that did not reach his eyes. "The world out there will not remain blind to what is happening here for long. The surrounding forests, the rivers that flow into other lords' lands. They will see, and when they see, they will come." He paused, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "We need to know what they think, what they plan, and we need to be ready." With this new intention, Ilara descended again to the underground chamber, the source of his power. This time, he did not mold robust workers. With agile hands and a concentrated mind, he began to create smaller, slenderer figures with shapes resembling agile animals, wolves, owls, even forms that resembled small humanoids, but with a more furtive silhouette, made to move unnoticed. "Vigilance," he whispered, infusing each new creation with his will. "Observation. Silence. Bring me information. Be my eyes and ears." One by one, the new clay creatures rose, their movements more fluid, faster. They were not for carrying stones, but for creeping through shadows, for climbing trees, for hiding in foliage. They were his scouts, his spies. He sent them out, a dozen silent forms that dispersed into the surrounding forests, into the valleys and hills that stretched beyond the visible limits of the castle. Meanwhile, activity in the castle intensified. New rooms were built, furnaces lit to heat water and cook the food brought by the servants. The magical clay, which seemed to be an inexhaustible supply, was used to create not only walls and roofs, but also rustic furniture, utensils, and even a drainage system for rainwater. The castle was becoming a true fortress, self-sufficient and impenetrable. But the transformation did not go unnoticed. Far away, in a small riverside village, a shepherd leading his flock to graze noticed the unusual smoke rising above the ruins of the old castle. It was not the sparse smoke of a bandit camp, but a constant, robust column, indicating sustained activity. He had avoided those ruins for years, haunted by stories of ghosts and misfortune. Now something was different. He ran to the village, his eyes wide with fear and curiosity. The rumors began as whispers, then spread like wildfire. The castle of the old man of clay, abandoned and cursed, was alive. Travelers who ventured too close reported strange sights, dark, silent figures working tirelessly, the sound of hammers and shovels without the presence of men. Some spoke of a strange, almost supernatural aura emanating from the stones. On his new improvised throne, made of stone and covered with furs, Ilara listened to the silent reports of his scouts. They returned, stopping before him, and the information was transmitted in some inexplicable way. Mental images, sensations, the essence of what they had seen and heard. He knew of the rumors, the gossip, the growing fear in neighboring villages. He knew of the lords who were beginning to send their own scouts, curious and suspicious. The tension was palpable, a thin mist in the air, a premonition that newly discovered power would bring with it not only redemption, but also conflict. "They will come," Ilara murmured to Finn, who stood beside him watching the clay scouts disperse again. "They will come to see, to question, perhaps even to try to take what is ours." His eyes, once full of weariness, now burned with a cold determination. "But they will find a kingdom, and a king, and the clay they despised will be the weapon that brings them down." Ilara's game was just beginning. The pieces on his board, made of clay and unwavering will, were in motion, and the world, which had laughed at his misery, was about to know the fury of the King of Clay, the old man of Clay's castle. The phrase, once a scornful whisper, was now uttered with a mix of dread and fascination in the neighboring villages and towns. The smoke rising from the ruins, once a sign of desolation, was now a constant column, a visible challenge on the horizon, a persistent reminder that something unnatural had awakened. Ilara's scouts, the slender clay creatures, returned more frequently, their visions increasingly detailed. Ilara not only saw the fear, he felt curiosity turn into alarm, alarm into suspicion, and suspicion into a latent hostility that simmered in the surrounding lands. In his main hall, once a heap of rubble and shame, now a vast space with polished clay walls and a ceiling of wood and clay that defied logic, Ilara sat on his improvised throne. Liam, now visibly stronger with rosy cheeks and his cough almost gone, played silently in a corner, oblivious to the storm gathering beyond the walls. Finn, however, was not oblivious. He watched his grandfather, whose eyes no longer carried the shadow of defeat, but the cold, calculating glint of a strategist. "Lord Valerius of Stone City has sent his own scouts," Ilara informed, his voice calm, but imbued with a newfound authority that resonated through the clay walls. 3 men on horseback, well armed. They approached the edge of the forest, observed for hours, and then returned hastily, as if they had seen a ghost. Finn swallowed hard, the sound almost inaudible in the silent hall. Valerius was known for his cruelty and for his vast, well-trained militia. What did they see, Grandpa? Enough to know that something extraordinary is happening here, enough to spread panic among his advisors, enough for him to consider this a direct threat to his dominion. Ilara stood, walking to one of the new windows, now sealed with thin mica panes that filtered the sunlight, offering a panoramic view of the surrounding forest. They will come, not just to observe, but to confront, to destroy what they do not understand, what they fear. But they will not find an old man cowering in ruins. He gestured, and dozens of clay servants, who had been working on building a new wing of the castle, turned to him, their bodies motionless, awaiting the next order. "We must be ready. Fortify the outer walls, create barriers, and prepare the Guardians." The Guardians were a new class of clay servants, an evolution of Ilara's will. Taller, more robust, with forms resembling ancient warriors, molded with hardened clay shields and spears that seemed to have emerged from the earth itself. They did not move, but stood motionless like statues along the walls, blending with the castle's structure until needed. They were the first line of defense, the silent and imposing manifestation of Ilara's will. Activity in the castle intensified, but with a new urgency, a palpable tension that permeated the air. The clay servants worked tirelessly, day and night, under the flickering light of resin torches and tallow candles. The outer walls were raised, becoming imposing barriers. The natural moat around the castle was deepened and filled with sharp stakes of wood and hardened clay, a deadly warning to anyone who dared approach. Drawbridges of clay and wood were erected, and massive gates, reinforced with the same magical substance, could be sealed in an instant, transforming the castle into an impregnable fortress. The castle, once a humiliating ruin, was now an impenetrable stronghold, a monster of clay and stone that seemed to have emerged from the earth itself to defy the sky. Valerius's scouts returned a few days later, this time in greater numbers, accompanied by a small contingent of mounted soldiers. They did not approach the forest, but set up camp at a safe distance, observing, their eyes fixed on the column of smoke and the new towers that rose. Ilara watched them from his watchtower, a cold, satisfied smile on his lips. "They are testing the waters, Finn, trying to gauge our strength, trying to understand the inexplicable." That night, under the silver moonlight, Ilara descended again to the underground chamber, the source of his power. But this time his intention was different, darker. He did not mold builders, nor spies, nor even static guardians. He molded clay creatures that resembled hunting dogs, but larger, fiercer, with wide jaws and empty eyes that seemed to absorb light. They were the trackers, made to pursue, to intimidate, to attack. He sent them into the forest, a silent pack that moved like shadows, circling Valerius's soldiers' camp. Not to attack, not yet, but to let their presence be felt, to sow terror. The next morning, Valerius's soldiers were in a panic. Their horses were restless, neighing and rearing. Their guard dogs had howled all night, a sound of pure terror. Strange footprints, large and heavy, were found around their camp, footprints that belonged to no known animal in the region, but that carried the damp smell of earth and a trail of fear. They packed their things and fled, spreading stories of clay monsters and a haunted castle that swallowed men. "They are scared," Finn said, watching the dust trail left by the retreating soldiers, a momentary relief in his voice. "They won't come back, will they?" Ilara turned to him, his eyes fixed on the distance beyond the forests and hills. "They will, but not alone. They will bring an army. And then, Finn, the real game will begin. The game I was born to play." The humiliation Ilara had suffered, the laughter and scornful glances of those who called him the old man of clay, were now the foundations of his empire. He was no longer the ashamed old man. He was the king of clay, and his kingdom, molded by his unwavering will, was ready to challenge the world. The tension was no longer a mist. It was an impending storm, and Ilara, at its center, was ready to reign. The trail of dust left by Valerius's soldiers did not dissipate into the air. It transformed into a cloud of panic that spread through neighboring villages and towns. The stories of the trackers, of monstrous footprints and the terror that haunted their camp, were told and retold, each time more exaggerated, until the clay monsters became earth demons and Ilara's castle a den of witchcraft and darkness. Fear was a silent weapon, and Ilara wielded it with mastery. In his main hall, light filtered through the mica panes danced on the polished clay walls, creating an atmosphere of deceptive serenity. Liam, oblivious to the gathering storm, laughed softly as he played with a small clay figure Ilara had molded for him, a bird that for an instant seemed almost ready to take flight. Finn, however, felt the weight of the atmosphere. He watched his grandfather, whose eyes, once weary, now gleamed with an almost feverish intensity. "They are terrified," Ilara said, his voice a satisfied murmur that, nevertheless, carried the weight of a prophecy. "Lord Valerius is furious. His honor has been stained, his pride wounded. He cannot allow such an affront to go unpunished." The clay scouts returned in waves, their visions transmitting Valerius's fury, the agitation in his court, the summoning of his banners. Ilara saw the mental image of Valerius, a corpulent man with a face red with rage, pounding his fist on the table, demanding revenge. He saw heralds galloping, villages emptying of men fit to fight, blacksmiths working day and night to forge weapons. "He's gathering an army," Finn whispered, his voice tense. "A real army, Grandpa. Men with steel swords and shields, not clay." Ilara smiled, a cold, humorless smile. "They will bring their steel, Finn, and we will give them the earth they tread upon, the earth they despise, the earth that will rise against them." He turned to the dozens of clay servants awaiting his orders, motionless as statues. "The time has come. We will build no more. Now, we will prepare for war." Activity in the castle reached a controlled frenzy. The walls, already imposing, were reinforced with additional layers of hardened clay, making them almost impenetrable. Watchtowers were raised, offering an even broader view of the surrounding lands. The moat, already deadly, was filled with a new and terrible surprise. Razor-sharp clay spikes that emerged from the muddy water like the teeth of a sleeping monster. But Ilara was not content with passive defenses. He descended again to the underground chamber, his mind teeming with new ideas, his will molding the magical substance with a precision and ferocity never before seen. He did not mold merely static guardians, he molded warriors. These were the clay soldiers, humanoid forms more agile and articulated than the guardians, with more flexible limbs and faces that, though empty, seemed to carry a grim intent. They were molded with hardened clay armor, shields that could absorb blows, and spears that could pierce. They were not made to think, but to obey, to fight, to die and reform from the earth itself. Beyond the soldiers, Ilara created something grander, more terrifying. In the central courtyard, under the moonlight, he molded the siege beasts, colossal creatures of clay and stone, with forms resembling prehistoric mammoths or rhinoceroses, but with a hardened clay carapace and pointed horns that could fell trees. They were slow but unstoppable, designed to break enemy lines and crush any resistance. Meanwhile, the clay scouts continued to bring reports. Valerius's army was on the move. A considerable force, with knights, spearmen, and archers, marched towards the castle, their banner with the rampant lion fluttering in the wind. They were not coming to negotiate. They were coming to destroy. "They are a day's march away," Finn informed, his voice a little firmer now, apprehension replaced by a strange resignation. He had seen his grandfather's power, the castle's transformation, the creation of an army that defied nature. Fear was still there, but mixed with a dark admiration. Ilara stood on the highest watchtower, observing the horizon. The wind blew, carrying the smell of damp earth and the premonition of iron and blood. He could feel the vibration of the earth beneath his feet, the approach of thousands of men. "Let them come," Ilara murmured, his eyes fixed in the direction from which the enemy approached. "Let them bring their fury and their contempt. They will see that the earth they have so trampled will now rise to crush them." He descended from the tower, his steps firm and decisive. In the courtyard, the clay soldiers were in formation, motionless, waiting. The siege beasts, gigantic and silent, seemed to breathe the cold night air. The entire castle was a living organism, pulsing with Ilara's will. "Prepare yourselves," he commanded, his voice resonating through the clay walls, no longer a murmur, but the roar of a king. "Tomorrow, the world will know the King of Clay, and what they thought was his ruin will be their tomb." The storm was no longer imminent. It was about to erupt, and Ilara, in the eye of the hurricane, was ready to reign over the ashes of his enemies. Dawn arrived, not with the soft promise of a new day, but with the cold, sharp tension of a blade about to fall. The sun, still low on the horizon, painted the sky with shades of red and orange, the colors that seemed to foretell bloodshed. In the clay castle, a heavy silence hung, broken only by the whisper of the wind and the occasional creak of the drawbridges. Ilara stood on the highest watchtower, his eyes fixed on the east, where a distant cloud of dust began to rise. Beside him, Finn watched, his face pale, but his eyes fixed and determined. Liam, still sleeping in his chambers, was oblivious to the approaching storm. The dust cloud grew, transforming into a dark and menacing mass that swallowed the horizon. Soon the sound arrived, a distant murmur that quickly turned into the thunder of thousands of boots and hooves, the clinking of armor, and the clamor of human voices. Valerius's army was there. It was an imposing sight, a serpent of steel and flesh stretching for miles. Knights on their richly adorned mounts, their polished armor reflecting the sunlight. Spearmen in tight formations, their steel tips gleaming like a forest of needles. Archers with their bows taut, ready to rain death. And in the center, Valerius's banner of the rampant lion, fluttering with the arrogance of one who expected an easy victory. "They come in great numbers," Finn whispered, his voice almost inaudible. He had never seen so many men gathered in one place. The scale of the enemy force was overwhelming. Ilara did not answer immediately. His eyes swept across the vast expanse of the army, absorbing every detail, every formation. A thin, almost imperceptible smile appeared on his lips. "They bring their strength, Finn, and their arrogance, but they do not know the strength of the earth." A herald from Valerius rode forward, mounted on a white stallion, his voice echoing through the valley, amplified by a war horn. "In the name of Lord Valerius the Just, protector of the western lands, I demand the immediate surrender of the usurper and his fortress of abominations. Surrender and your lives will be spared. Resist, and Valerius's fury will fall upon you like lightning." Elara made no move to respond. He merely raised his hand, a silent gesture understood by the clay servants. On the walls, the static guardians, previously blended into the structure itself, began to move slowly, their hardened clay forms standing out against the sky. At the gates, the clay soldiers took their positions. Their spears pointed at the enemy. Elara's answer was silence, a silence that Valerius interpreted as defiance. The war horn sounded again, this time with a sharper, more imperative tone. "Advance!" The first wave of Valerius's soldiers surged forward, a mass of light infantry and archers rushing towards the castle. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Arrows began to rain down, hitting the walls with a hollow sound, bouncing harmlessly off the hardened clay forms of the guardians. A few struck the clay soldiers, but the arrows embedded themselves in their bodies, which simply absorbed the impact, without pain, without recoil. The enemy vanguard reached the moat. What they expected was a simple ditch, perhaps with water. What they found was an abyss of dark clay, dotted with thousands of razor-sharp clay spikes emerging from the muddy surface, like the teeth of a hungry monster. The damp, earthy smell of death hung in the air. The first men to try to cross fell, their screams of horror echoing as they were impaled by the hidden spikes. The moat, once a barrier, was now a slaughterhouse. The soldiers hesitated, the momentum of their attack broken by the macabre sight. "Open the gates!" Elara commanded, his voice calm but laden with authority. The clay and wood gates opened slowly, revealing the darkness of the inner courtyard. And then they emerged. The clay soldiers in hundreds, in thousands, flowing from the castle like a river of terror, and behind them the siege beasts. The colossal creatures of clay and stone, with their hardened carapaces and pointed horns, advanced with inexorable slowness, but with a force that made the earth tremble. They were clay mammoths, stone rhinoceroses, manifestations of the earth's own fury. Valerius's army, which expected a conventional battle, was caught by surprise. Their horses neighed in terror at the sight of the siege beasts, rearing and throwing their riders. The infantry soldiers who had stopped at the moat now found themselves surrounded by the clay soldiers emerging from the castle. The battle became chaos. Human swords and spears struck against the clay bodies, cutting, smashing, but with no lasting effect. The clay soldiers, without pain, without fear, without hesitation, advanced, their clay spears piercing armor, their shields absorbing blows. If a limb was severed, the clay writhed, reformed, and the clay warrior continued to fight. The siege beasts broke through enemy lines like living battering rams, crushing men and horses under their gigantic feet. Panic spread through Valerius's ranks. What was this? Demons? Witchcraft? Valerius, from his position in the rear, watched with disbelief and fury. His generals shouted orders, trying to reorganize the troops, but fear was contagious. His men, trained to fight other men, were powerless against an enemy that could not be killed, that rose from the earth itself. Elara watched everything from his tower, a macabre maestro conducting his orchestra of destruction. His eyes gleamed with cold satisfaction. The humiliation he had suffered, the laughter, the scornful glances, all of it was being repaid in blood and clay. Night began to fall, but the battle did not cease. Torches were lit in Valerius's lines, illuminating the horror of the carnage. The screams of the wounded, the clang of metal, the damp sound of clay writhing, all blended into an infernal symphony. Valerius's first assault had failed miserably. His men were exhausted, terrified, and their casualties were countless. The army that marched with such confidence was now in disarray, slowly retreating, leaving behind a trail of bodies and despair. "They are retreating," Finn said, his voice choked with a mixture of relief and horror. Elara nodded, his eyes still fixed on the battlefield. "They learned a lesson today, Finn. The lesson that the earth is not just something to be trodden upon. It is something that can rise and fight. But the most important lesson is yet to come." The night brought a brief ceasefire, but no relief. The battlefield was covered with human bodies and fragments of clay. The smell of blood and wet earth hung heavy in the air. Valerius had suffered a humiliating defeat, but the war was far from over. Ilara knew that the true test was yet to come. He had shown his strength, but now he needed to consolidate his power. The tension was palpable. The promise of more blood and clay hung over the castle. The King of Clay had made his declaration. The world had been warned. The night that followed Valerius's first assault brought no rest, only a tense pause in the carnage. On the battlefield, under the pale moonlight, the horror of Valerius's defeat was visible. Human bodies lay scattered like broken dolls, mingled with fragments of clay that somehow seemed to writhe and slowly reintegrate into the earth. The smell of blood, sweat, and wet earth hung heavy in the air, a mournful omen. In Valerius's camp, chaos reigned. The wounded groaned, the generals shouted orders that no one seemed to hear, and fear spread like a plague. Men who had marched with the arrogance of guaranteed victory now trembled, their eyes fixed on the clay fortress that seemed to mock them in the darkness. They had faced something that defied logic, something that could not be killed, that rose from the earth itself to crush them. Valerius, in his command tent, was in a frenzy of fury. He had lost hundreds, perhaps thousands of men in a single assault, and the humiliation was unbearable. His fists pounded the table, his eyes red with rage and disbelief. What was that? He growled at his generals, who cowered before his wrath. Demons! Witchcraft! How can they fight something that doesn't bleed, that doesn't die? One of the generals, a grizzled man with scars from countless battles, dared to speak. My lord, the clay creatures. They are indestructible by conventional means. Swords and spears barely scratch them, and if a limb is severed, it reforms. It's like fighting the earth itself. Valerius gnashed his teeth. Then we will not fight the earth with swords. There are other ways to destroy the earth. Fire! What happens to clay when exposed to fire, General? It hardens, it cracks, it becomes brittle, or it dries and turns to dust. The general's eyes widened. The idea was audacious, desperate, but perhaps the only hope. Fire, my lord, but the walls are clay and the castle... Burn it! Valerius roared, pounding the table again. Burn every piece of clay, every filthy creature. Bring the oils, the torches, the incendiary battering rams. If we cannot crush them, we will roast them until they turn to dust. Meanwhile, in the clay castle, an almost reverent silence hung. Ilara was in his watchtower, observing the enemy camp. He could feel Valerius's fury, the shift in the air, the new strategy forming in his enemy's mind. He knew that the defeat of the first wave would only fuel Valerius's rage, making him more dangerous. They will come with fire, Ilara murmured, his voice a whisper to the wind. Finn, beside him, shivered. Fire was the natural enemy of Earth, a purifying and destructive force. But the castle, Finn began, his voice full of apprehension. Ilara turned to him, a grim smile on his lips. The castle is the earth, Finn, and the earth can defend itself. Fire can harden clay, yes, but it can also create something stronger, and the earth has its own secrets to fight fire. He descended from the tower, his steps echoing in the castle's silence. In the courtyard, the clay servants were motionless, but not inactive. Small fissures in their bodies closed, severed limbs slowly reformed, absorbing moisture from the air and the castle's structure itself. They were tireless, eternal, an army that healed itself while the enemy trembled. Ilara walked to the center of the courtyard, extending his hands. The earth beneath his feet responded. He felt the vibration, the latent energy. He was not just molding the clay. He was becoming one with it. His mind was the mind of the earth, his will, the will of the clay. Prepare the defenses, he commanded, his voice resonating with a new authority. Not for iron, but for fire. Let the earth show its resilience. Let them bring their flames, and we will show them what happens when fire tries to consume the very soil that feeds it." Night advanced, and with it, the preparation for the next phase of the battle. In Valerius's camp, the sound of axes felling trees and the creak of wagons loaded with oil and dry wood filled the air. Torches burned, illuminating the frantic activity. They were building incendiary siege weapons, preparing flaming arrows, transforming their army into a force of pyromaniac destruction. In Ilara's castle, the preparation was silent but equally intense. The clay servants worked tirelessly, reinforcing the walls with a denser, wetter layer of clay, mixing it with stones and minerals Ilara had discovered in his excavations, elements that would better resist heat. New creatures, more robust and fire-resistant, began to be molded, their forms more compact and dense like living rocks. Liam, still in his chambers, slept a restless sleep, oblivious to the war unfolding. Ilara, for a brief moment, paused at his door, watching his grandson. A flicker of humanity, of concern, crossed his hardened face, but was quickly replaced by steely determination. He was doing this for Liam, to ensure his grandson never suffered the same humiliation he had. Dawn arrived again, but this time, the air was charged not only with the tension of blood, but with the acrid smell of smoke and the promise of flames. The dust cloud rising from Valerius's camp was not just from boots and hooves, but also from dark smoke. Valerius, on his stallion, watched the castle, his eyes burning with renewed fury. "Advance!" he roared, his voice hoarse, but laden with a new and terrible conviction. "Burn the abomination to ashes! Let fire purify this land!" The second wave of attack began, not with the clinking of swords, but with the crackle of torches and the roar of incendiary battering rams. Flaming arrows began to rain down on the castle, turning the sky into a shower of fiery shooting stars. The King of Clay was ready, the earth was ready to burn, and to fight fire with its own strength. Dawn brought not just light, but a blazing inferno. Flaming arrows streaked across the sky like death's falling stars, raining down on the clay castle. The incendiary battering ram, a beast of wood and metal soaked in oil, roared as Valerius's men pushed it forward, a living torch advancing against the walls. The acrid smell of smoke and burning oil mingled with the steam rising from the damp clay, creating a suffocating haze. Valerius, from his elevated position, watched with grim satisfaction. Fire was purification, the ultimate answer. He expected to see the walls crack, the clay dry and crumble, the clay servants turn to dust. But the earth had its own secrets. The first arrows hit the walls with a sizzling hiss. Instead of igniting, the damp clay absorbed the impact, and the flames for a brief moment danced on the surface before being suffocated by the moisture. Where the fire persisted, the clay began to harden, transforming into a dark, resistant ceramic crust. It did not crumble, it hardened. The incendiary battering ram collided with the main gate, an explosion of flames and smoke. Valerius's soldiers shouted in triumph, expecting the gate to yield. But what they found was unexpected resistance. The clay, mixed with stones and minerals Ilara had discovered, did not disintegrate. It became denser, more compact, like a living rock that absorbed heat and impact, transforming into an impenetrable barrier. From the castle's flanks, new clay creatures emerged. These were not the slender warriors of the previous night, but more robust, almost spherical forms, their surfaces already hardened by the earth's internal heat. They were Ilara's living rocks, slow but relentless, rolling like giant boulders towards the enemy lines. The fire that struck them only made them harder, hotter, turning them into incandescent projectiles. "Advance! More fire!" Valerius roared, his voice already tinged with frustration. He couldn't understand. Fire was supposed to destroy, not strengthen. Valerius's catapults began to launch barrels of burning oil over the castle. When the barrels burst, the oil spread and flames licked the walls. The castle seemed to burn, but it was an illusion. The clay under Ilara's direction reacted. Where the fire was most intense, the surface hardened rapidly, creating a protective layer. And from the depths of the walls, jets of steam and damp clay were expelled, suffocating the most persistent flames. The original clay soldiers, those who had fought the previous night, now advanced from the castle gates. Their bodies, which had reformed and absorbed the protective minerals, now shone with a darker hue, almost metallic in some places. They were not immune to fire, but they were resistant. The flames hardened them, making their blows heavier, their forms more compact. The battle became an infernal spectacle of fire and earth. The screams of human soldiers mingled with the hiss of clay, the crackle of flames, and the damp sound of clay bodies writhing and reforming. The living rocks rolled over enemy lines, crushing men and equipment, their incandescent surfaces burning everything they touched. Valerius watched, his fury growing with each passing minute. His eyes, once full of confidence, now reflected pure terror. His men, who had marched with torches and oil, now faced an enemy that seemed to feed on fire itself. They were being roasted alive, crushed by walking stones, and attacked by creatures that grew stronger with every flame. "Retreat! Retreat!" A general's cry cut through the air, but it was too late. Panic spread again, faster than fire. Valerius's soldiers were trapped between the inferno of flames they themselves had created and the clay army that could not be burned. Ilara, from his tower, watched the chaos below. A slow, cold smile spread across his lips. Fire, which should have been the ruin of the earth, had become its ally. He was not just molding the clay, he was teaching the earth to fight, to adapt, to become invincible. The humiliation he had suffered was being washed away not only in blood, but in ashes and hardened clay. "They thought they could burn the earth," Ilara murmured to Finn, who stood beside him, pale but awestruck. "But the earth does not burn. The earth transforms, and now it will become stronger than ever." Smoke rose in dense spirals, obscuring the sun. The clay castle, once a humble ruin, now stood as a dark, smouldering fortress, a monument to the earth's resilience. Valerius had tried to purify what he considered an abomination with fire, but instead he had forged a more powerful and terrifying weapon. The King of Clay had proven that he was not only the master of life, but also the master of transformation, and the world had not yet seen the true power of the earth. Dawn, which Valerius hoped would be the sunrise of his victory, transformed into a twilight of smoke and defeat. The battlefield, once a stage for promised glory, was now a graveyard of burned hopes. Valerius, his armor stained with soot, and his face contorted in a mask of fury and disbelief, galloped back to what remained of his camp. The air still carried the acrid smell of burning oil and scorched flesh, a cruel reminder of his defeat. His generals, once arrogant, now cowered before his gaze, unable to offer explanations for the impossible. How can fire fail? Valerius's voice was no longer a roar, but a hoarse whisper, laden with a venom that surpassed any flame. He pounded the map table in his tent, his eyes fixed on the clay castle which in the distance now seemed a dark and invincible fortress, smoking like a dormant volcano. "They fed on our attack. They grew stronger with our fire." The panic among his troops was an open, festering wound. The soldiers, who once marched with the certainty of victory, now told stories of walking stones, of men swallowed by incandescent earth, of creatures that grew harder with every blow. The fear of Ilara, the King of Clay, had taken deep root, more than any military tactic could combat. Valerius knew that a new frontal attack would be suicide. He needed a new strategy, one that did not rely on brute force but on cunning. Meanwhile, in the castle, Ilara wasted no time savoring the victory. the smoke, still hanging over the walls, was a veil of glory for him. He walked through the courtyard, his steps firm, while the clay servants, now darker and denser, moved with a new discipline. The living rocks, once slow, now seemed to have a more defined purpose, their incandescent surfaces pulsing with absorbed heat. "The earth does not merely defend itself, Finn," Ilara said, his voice calm, but with an authority that made the very air vibrate. "It advances, it consumes, and now it claims what is rightfully its own." He extended his hands, and the earth responded. Not only new watchtowers and denser walls emerged. From the ground, structures sprouted beyond the castle limits, like gigantic roots that branched out, forming natural barriers, deep trenches, and even small elevations that offered strategic observation points. The clay servants, now more resilient, were sent on extended patrols, not just to watch, but to demarcate the new territory of the King of Clay. They were the vanguard of a silent but relentless expansion. Liam, watching from his window, felt a shiver run down his spine. Admiration for his grandfather mingled with a growing dread. Ilara was no longer the humiliated old man he knew. He was a force of nature, an architect of a new world, and his power seemed limitless. The castle, once a ruin, was now a living, pulsating organism that breathed and expanded under its master's will. Liam watched the clay servants moving away, their dark, ardent forms blending into the landscape, and imagined what they would find, what they would do. The earth was not just defending itself, it was conquering. News of Valerius's defeat spread like wildfire. Messengers, pale and breathless, brought reports of a castle that could not be burned, of clay creatures that grew stronger with fire, of an old man who had transformed into an invincible king. Other lords, previously amused by the idea of a king of clay, now felt a chill of apprehension. What Valerius had encountered was not a simple rebellion, but something much older and more primordial. In his camp, Valerius, after days of feverish deliberation, finally summoned his generals. His eyes, though still filled with fury, now gleamed with a new and dangerous determination. "We cannot burn them," he admitted, his voice low, almost a hiss. "But we can suffocate them, we can cut their veins. Whatever gives life to this clay must have a source, and that source, we will find it and destroy it." His new strategy was more insidious. He would send spies, not to fight, but to observe, to learn. He wanted to understand the nature of Ilara's magic, the origin of his power. He ordered his troops, now fewer in number but more disciplined, to begin encircling the castle from a distance, cutting off supply routes, isolating it from the outside world. He would not attack directly, but tighten the siege, hoping that the earth itself or its master would reveal its weakness. "If we cannot burn them," Valerius murmured, a cold, cruel smile forming on his lips, "then we will dry them out. We will let them die of thirst. Clay needs water, doesn't it? And the earth, however magical, cannot live without it." The war had changed. It was no longer a confrontation of brute force and fire, but a deadly chess game where patience and cunning would be the new weapons. Ilara had proven that the earth did not burn. Now, Valerius was determined to prove that the earth would eventually dry up, and the King of Clay, on his hardened clay throne, felt the change in the air, the new threat approaching, as silent and relentless as the earth itself. The game was just beginning. The air, once laden with the acrid smell of smoke and the promise of annihilation, now grew heavy with an insidious quiet. Ilara felt the change, even before his eyes confirmed it. There was no longer the clamor of a retreating army, nor the distant glow of campfires. The landscape around the clay castle, once a battlefield, was now an oppressive emptiness. Valerius had retreated, yes, but not to give up. He had retreated to tighten the noose. The new strategy was a whisper on the wind, a creeping shadow. Ilara felt the siege closing, not with swords and fire, but with absence. Supply routes, previously precarious, were now non-existent. The streams that snaked through the lowlands, once sources of life, now seemed slower, their waters murky and scarce. Valerius did not want to burn the castle. He wanted to suffocate it, dry it out, turn it to dust. Liam, from the highest tower, watched with growing apprehension. The clay scouts Ilara had sent returned with reports of blocked roads, deserted villages, poisoned or sealed wells. Silence was Valerius's most potent weapon, and he wielded it with calculating coldness. Water, the essence of life, was becoming an unattainable luxury. Fear, a more subtle enemy than fire, began to infiltrate the minds of the few humans still residing in the castle. Ilara, however, showed no signs of panic. His eyes, deep and ancient, gazed at the horizon with a disturbing calm. He walked among his clay servants, who now seemed even more robust, their ceramic surfaces reflecting the pale sunlight. They were living proof that the earth could resist fire. But could they resist thirst? "The earth needs water, grandfather," Liam dared to say, his voice a thread of worry. "We need water." Ilara turned to his grandson, an enigmatic smile playing on his lips. "The earth is water, my dear Liam, and water is earth. One does not exist without the other, and both answer to me." He extended his hands, not to the sky for rain, but to the ground beneath his feet. He closed his eyes, and a palpable energy emanated from him, pulsing through the courtyard, penetrating the walls, descending into the depths of the earth. The clay servants, previously motionless, began to stir. It was not a movement of attack, but of excavation, of search. In response to Ilara's silent command, the earth began to tremble softly. It was not an earthquake, but an organic movement, like that of a living organism stretching and contracting. From the ground, at various points in the courtyard and within the walls, thin columns of clay sprouted, twisting and deepening, like gigantic roots seeking the hidden veins of the world. The clay servants, with their hardened forms, became the perfect tools for this task, piercing rock, digging tunnels that extended downwards, deeper and deeper. Valerius, in his distant camp, received reports from his spies. "They are digging, my lord," one of them reported, pale. "Not outwards, but downwards, and there are no signs of despair. The clay still moves, and the castle seems alive." Valerius pounded the table. "Impossible! The earth dries, water runs out. What kind of witchcraft is this?" He had anticipated hunger, thirst, internal rebellion. But Ilara was not fighting nature. He was being nature. In the castle, Ilara's response began to manifest. From the depths, a distant murmur, a sound of running water, began to echo through the newly formed tunnels. The clay servants, with a new urgency, widened the passages, and then, with a soft gurgle, the first drop of clean, fresh water sprang from one of the clay columns, followed by a steady flow. It was not a stream, but a spring, pure and abundant, gushing from the heart of the earth. Liam watched, open-mouthed, as the water formed small pools in the courtyard, and the clay servants, with renewed purpose, began to channel it into clay reservoirs that rose from the ground. Ilara had not just found water. He had created a spring, drawing it from the very essence of the planet. "The earth does not dry, Liam," Ilara said, his voice now imbued with a power that made the air vibrate. "It transforms, it adapts, and for those who listen to it, it always provides." Valerius's humiliation had been washed away by fire, but now his cunning was being drowned by the very source of life. The war had changed again. It was no longer a game of strength or strategy, but a test of faith in the very essence of the world. Ilara had proven that the earth did not burn. Now he proved that the earth never dried, not as long as he was its herald, its king. Valerius, upon receiving news of the springs gushing from the castle, felt a chill run down his spine. The cruel smile on his lips vanished, replaced by an expression of pure terror. He had underestimated the King of Clay. It was not just magic. It was a primordial connection, a symbiosis that defied all known laws. The earth was not just his battlefield. It was his ally, his weapon, his very being. And the game, he realized with a shiver, was only just beginning to reveal its true and terrifying depth. Valerius, in his camp, was no longer the arrogant general who had marched with fire and fury. The icy terror that coursed through him was more potent than any flame he could conjure. The springs gushing from the clay, the earth that refused to dry, the very life that defied death. All of it was an affront not only to his strategy, but to his understanding of the world. He had underestimated Ilara, yes, but it was not just a man. It was a primordial force, a symbiosis with the very essence of the planet. The cruel smile on his lips had vanished, replaced by an expression of pure dread. The war, he realized with a shiver that ran down his spine, was no longer about domination, but about existence. "He cannot be burned," Valerius muttered to himself, his voice hoarse, almost inaudible. "Cannot be suffocated, cannot be made thirsty." His generals watched him, tense, awaiting an order, a plan. But what was there to plan against something that was the earth itself? "If we cannot destroy the earth," he finally said, raising his eyes, which now gleamed with desperate madness, "then we must destroy the connection. We must cut the roots, not of the plant, but of the very tree that feeds it. We must poison the source." His new strategy was a plunge into the abyss, a final gamble against the unknown. Valerius would no longer seek conventional weapons, but something that could corrupt, pervert, or even reverse the magic Ilara wielded. He summoned the few sages and mages he still tolerated in his retinue, men dedicated to obscure studies and forbidden scrolls, whose reputations were as stained as their robes. "There are legends," he hissed, his voice laden with feverish urgency, "of a magic that can turn the earth against itself. A force that can drain the life from a river or transform fertile soil into barren desert, or even corrupt the very essence of life. Find it. Find whatever can break the link between the old man and his clay." The spies, previously tasked with observing the castle, now had a more dangerous mission, a journey to the ends of the kingdom and beyond. They were to travel to forgotten libraries, to reclusive hermits who whispered of ancient magic, to ruins where dark pacts were made and where sunlight rarely reached. They were to search for cursed artifacts, for rituals of desolation, for anything that could upset the balance of nature. Valerius was willing to pay any price, to make any pact, to sacrifice anyone, to tear Ilara's power away. The earth was the life of the King of Clay, and Valerius swore he would turn it into his death. Meanwhile, in the clay castle, life flourished in a way that defied logic and the very nature of a siege. The water sources, now abundant, not only supplied the needs of the few humans and the clay servants, but also irrigated small gardens that Ilara, with a touch of his power, had made sprout from the hardened soil. The castle was no longer just a fortress, it was a self-sufficient ecosystem, an oasis of life amidst a siege that sought desolation. The walls extended, the towers rose, each new structure a silent testament to Ilara's power. The clay servants, previously crude forms, now seemed more refined, more adapted. Some became guardians of the springs, their robust forms protecting the jets of clear water. Others, tireless builders, erecting new structures, expanding the walls beyond what Valerius could imagine. There were even smaller servants, agile and discreet, who moved through the new crops, tending the seedlings, as if the earth itself had instructed them. The symbiosis between Ilara and his kingdom was complete, a silent orchestra of growth and power. Liam observed everything with a mixture of admiration and a growing dread. His grandfather, the humiliated old man, had become a minor god, an architect of life and death. Each day, Ilara's power seemed to deepen, his connection with the earth becoming more intimate. He did not merely command the clay, he was the clay, and the clay was him. But the grandeur of his power brought with it a shadow, a sense that such dominion might come at a cost, a vulnerability yet to be revealed. The quietness of the castle, once a refuge, now seemed almost oppressive. Ilara, on his clay throne, felt the change in the air. It was not the smell of smoke or the sound of armies, it was something more subtle, a tremor in the earth's veins, a distant whisper that was not from Valerius, but from something Valerius was seeking. The earth, his most faithful ally, began to send him warnings. There was a disturbance in the flow of magic, a search for ancient and dangerous knowledge that could unbalance nature itself, a poison for the heart of the world. He closed his eyes, extending his consciousness beyond the walls, to the distant forests, to the rugged mountains. He felt the agitation of Valerius's spies, no longer looking for physical weaknesses, but for something that could corrupt the very essence of his power. They were digging in forgotten places, unearthing secrets that should remain buried. The threat was no longer the sword or the fire, it was desecration, the perversion of the very life he now represented. "They seek darkness, my grandson," Ilara said to Liam, without opening his eyes. His voice was calm, but there was a gravity in it that Liam had never heard before. "They have found the darkness that seeks to silence the world, the barren heart." He opened his eyes, and Liam saw in them not the gleam of a god, but the fierce determination of a guardian. But the earth is not just life, Liam. It is also the death that precedes rebirth. It is the stillness that absorbs chaos. And it has its own means of defending itself against those who seek to corrupt it. The quietness of the castle seemed to absorb his words, transforming them into a prophecy. Valerius, impatient, awaited the return of his emissaries. Each passing day was torture. Each report of Ilara prospering was a nail in his coffin. He knew he was in a race against time, that the King of Clay not only defended himself, but advanced, consolidating his power, becoming more than a king, but a living legend. The outside world, once skeptical, now whispered stories of a clay kingdom that defied death, and of an old man who had become the very incarnation of the earth. The other lords, previously amused, were now divided between terror and the temptation to ally with Valerius in his desperate quest. Some saw Ilara as an abomination, others as a new and powerful force to be feared or courted. The war was no longer just between two men, but a conflict that threatened to redefine the very balance of power, the very nature of magic and life. Valerius had staked everything on his new and dangerous quest, and the earth, through Ilara, was ready to respond. The game was about to become much darker, much older. The agony of waiting gnawed at Valerius more than any battlefield defeat. Every minute was a testament to Ilara's ascent, a reminder of his own impotence. The clay castle, once a joke, now stood as a living monument, its walls pulsing with a life that defied death itself. The whispers of the outside world had turned into stories of reverence and dread, and Valerius felt his power slip away like sand through his fingers. The earth was no longer his to conquer. It was Ilara's domain. Then one day, one of the emissaries returned. He was not the same man who had left. His eyes were sunken, his skin pale, but in his hands he carried an object wrapped in dark cloths, an obsidian orb, smooth and cold to the touch, that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. A murmur of ancient malevolent power emanated from it, a promise of desolation. The emissary, his voice hoarse, reported having found a hermit in the depths of a forgotten forest. a being who had made pacts with shadows to learn the secrets of anti-life, of primordial desolation. The orb, he explained, was a barren heart, capable of draining the vitality from anything it touched, turning life to dust, fertility to desert. And, more importantly, it could corrupt the very essence of elemental magic, severing the link between a being and the earth. Valerius felt a wave of icy triumph. This was it, the perfect weapon, not to destroy the earth, but to destroy Ilara's connection to it, to turn him from a king of clay back into a pathetic old man. In the castle, Ilara felt the change. It was not a physical tremor, but a shiver in the very soul of the earth. The water springs, previously gushing with vigor, now seemed to hesitate, their waters colder, almost fearful. The clay servants, previously tireless, moved with a strange slowness, their robust forms seeming more fragile, as if the clay itself were losing its cohesion. An invisible shadow, an echo of despair, began to spread through the walls, through the gardens, even through the air they breathed. The heart of the earth, which Ilara felt as his own, was being threatened. "They found it," Ilara said, his eyes still closed, his voice a grave whisper that seemed to come from the depths of the castle. Liam, beside him, felt a chill down his spine. They found the darkness that seeks to silence the world, the barren heart. He opened his eyes, and Liam saw in them not the gleam of a god, but the fierce determination of a guardian. But the earth is not just life, Liam. It is also the death that precedes rebirth. It is the stillness that absorbs chaos. And it has its own means of defending itself against those who seek to corrupt it. Valerius, impatient, did not wait. He marched with the barren heart in his hands, not with an army, but with a handful of his most loyal mages, those who had embraced the darkness. They approached the castle walls, and the air around them began to distort, life to wither. The grass beneath their feet dried and crumbled to dust. The distant trees, once green, became twisted skeletons. An aura of desolation spread, a silent plague seeking to transform the world into an emptiness. When Valerius raised the orb, a wave of cold black energy erupted, striking the clay walls. Where the energy touched, the clay did not burn or crumble. It petrified. The living clay, malleable and full of purpose, hardened, turned gray and cold, losing its essence, its connection. The clay servants on the walls were struck, and their forms transformed into motionless statues, their expressions of eternal labor frozen in stone. The water source, previously crystalline, began to cloud, its waters diminishing, threatening to dry up. Panic began to spread among the few humans within the castle. Liam felt his heart tighten. Was this the end? Was the earth being silenced? But Ilara did not despair. He rose from his throne, and the very earth beneath his feet seemed to vibrate in response. He extended his hands, not to repel the darkness, but to embrace it. "The earth cannot be silenced," his voice echoed, not from his throat, but from the depths of the soil, a primordial thunder. "It absorbs, it transforms, it is reborn." The black energy of the barren heart struck Ilara, but he did not petrify. Instead, the clay that composed him, that was him, began to stir, to bubble. The grey color of desolation tried to spread through his body, but it was absorbed, dissolved. Ilara was becoming a vortex, a point of convergence where life and anti-life met. The earth responded to its king. From the depths, it was no longer just water that sprang, but a torrent of fresh, dark, pulsating clay, which erupted from the walls, from the towers, from the ground itself. This clay was not just mud. It was the essence of life, the primordial force of creation. It spread like a tide, engulfing the petrification, dissolving the servant statues, transforming the grey stone back into a vital flow. The wave of clay advanced beyond the walls, towards Valerius and his mages. The barren heart, which once drained life, now seemed to struggle against an overwhelming force of regeneration. The clay did not attack them with violence, but with relentless persistence, a flood of life that sought to reclaim what had been corrupted. Valerius's mages tried to resist, but the clay was more than matter. It was the very will of the earth. It enveloped them, not to crush, but to absorb, to transform. Their forms dissolved, returning to the earth from which they came, their dark magics neutralized and purified. Valerius, in his final terror, tried to raise the barren heart again, but the clay had already reached him. It did not crush him, but enveloped him slowly and inexorably, rising up his legs, his torso, his arms. He screamed a sound of pure despair as the black orb in his hands was swallowed, its darkness dissipated by the torrent of life. Valerius was not destroyed. He was reabsorbed. His form dissolved into the clay, becoming part of the earth he had so despised. His ambition and hatred transformed into nothing more than nutrients for the soil. Ilara, amidst the torrent of clay, was changed. His form was more fluid, more imposing. His eyes glowed with the light of the earth itself, and his skin seemed made of the purest clay. Alive and pulsating, he was no longer just a man who commanded clay. He was the clay, the very incarnation of the earth, a king who had merged with his kingdom. Liam watched, awestruck and terrified. His grandfather had become a legend, a force of nature. The clay castle, now vaster and more vibrant than ever, was no longer a fortress, but a sanctuary, a pulsating heart of life in a world that had witnessed the battle between desolation and regeneration. The war had ended, not with swords or fire, but with the very essence of existence. Ilara, the king of clay, had proven that the earth could not be burned, nor made thirsty, nor corrupted. It was life, death, and rebirth, an eternal cycle that swallowed darkness and transformed it into new life. And he, the humiliated old man, was now its herald, its guardian, its very being. The world would never be the same.